in this lesson, we want to take this flat list where each item is not very pretty, it's not clear, we can't actually tap them, we can't do anything with them. We want to take it from this to actually working through what we've got here in this mockup. So you can see we actually style the text, we give it some extra room, we've got this border between each one of the elements, and then we've also got this icon over on the right side. And if you're going to build this ahead of time, just know there's a few requirements for this list item, because we're going to be using it in multiple places throughout our application. We're building this component once so we can use it in multiple places. And those requirements are as follows for this right icon. First off, we need to be able to specify whether this check mark should be visible or not. Then we want to specify whether this row is selected. So if CAD is the current currency, we want to be able to specify if that is indeed the selected one. And then finally, we want to be able to specify, even if it is selected, whether this icon should be visible or not. So with those in mind, if you want to build ahead, go ahead, just keep those in mind. Otherwise, let's start building. So the first thing I want to do is actually go to my index.js, and we're going to add a new variable to this eStyleSheet.build in our app/index.js, just because we're going to be using this later on. And that's going to be dark text, and it's going to be 343434. We can save that, and that'll be good to go here. Next thing we want to do is actually create a new component that's going to hold all of our list related components. So we can go ahead and say list. And then in here, we've got our typical files. We've got styles.js, we'll have index.js, and we're also going to have a few additional things here. We're going to set up, obviously, our list item.js. We're also going to set up a separator.js, which will represent the separator. And then finally, we want to set up our icon.js. So like always, let's do the boring stuff first. We're going to import list item from list item. Alright, so we've got all of our exports set up. Let's go ahead and continue setting up the boilerplate. We're going to set up our basic extended style sheet. We're not going to add the styles yet, but import eStyleSheet from React Native extended style sheet. You know how to do this one. We've done it a dozen times already. And then for the actual components, we're just going to be very basic at this point, and we're just going to return a function. So we're going to say in this one, separator, and then we'll just return null. That way we can actually call these things and not have to actually worry about them working, because null is a valid React Native component. So now we can do the same for list item, and then finally for icon. So all of our boilerplate is set up. Oops, save this one. So we've also got a few images related to our list, and those are going to be those check marks that we've got. So I'm going to reveal this in Finder and actually paste those images in. As always, those are available to you down below, and it's just this basic check mark that we're using, and we've got the 3 different pixel densities there. Now let's actually try to render that list item component that we've set up. So up here, I'm going to import list item from components list, right? And then this will be called from our render item, and we won't actually pass any props to it right now, but we'll just say list item and self-close that. So we've got this blank screen. That's fine. We shouldn't expect to render anything because we haven't passed anything to it yet. And speaking of things that should be passed to this list item, we've got 3 primary things. The first is going to be whatever text should be rendered for this. And let's bump this down onto a new line just to make it a bit easier to read. So yeah, we've got the text, and the text is just going to be the item row because that's just text. We also want to specify whether or not this item is currently selected. So to do that, we can just say if the item is equal to CAD in the example, but I don't want to keep that CAD down here just because that's only a temporary thing, and we will be pulling that out later. So I'm going to say temp current currency. Then we can go ahead and define this up here. Temp current currency is going to be equal to CAD. So that's all set up. And then we also want to specify the onPress handler. So when one of these rows is pressed, we'll actually handle that. So handle press. And with this in mind, you can see that we've already set this up ahead of time, just a standard function on a component, and this will be called whenever one of these row items is actually pressed. And you can see I'm getting a few errors here, so I'm going to add some parentheses around my code so that it will actually render. And let's see what happens here. Okay, so we're passing all of this content down to our list item, which means we can actually start building that. So I'll go to my list item.js, and then we can start building things out from here. So first things we know that we're going to be passed a text prop, we're going to be passed an onPress, and we're also going to be passed a selected prop. And knowing those things, we can actually go ahead and start importing the various components we're going to need from React Native. First off, of course, we're going to need a view to wrap our component. We also need a text element to render our text. We'll be using a touchable highlight to actually handle the touch for the onPress. And that should be good to go on this front. So all of this setup, we can actually go ahead and start building up our component. First, we will do a touchable highlight on the outside, just so that everything is actually wrapped in it. And then to this touchable highlight, we'll pass that onPress prop to it. Next, and I mentioned this earlier, but rather than applying a style to this touchable highlight, I'm going to apply styles that will actually handle displaying the content within our item row within a view, just because I find it to work much more consistently than applying styles to a touchable highlight, or any touchable for that matter. And inside of here is where we will actually be specifying the text, so we can just say text here. And then finally, let's go ahead and take care of these prop type warnings. So in addition to React, I'm going to import prop types, and then we can go down here and say list item dot prop types. Finally, got it. And then we know we've got the text, that's going to be prop types dot string. We've got onPress, which is going to be prop types dot func, representing a function. And then finally, we've got selected, which is going to be prop types dot bool, representing a boolean, which that selected will be. And just in the meantime, just until we set up our icon, let's also just say if it's selected, we'll return text that says selected. Otherwise, we'll just return null, because we don't care if it's not selected. We don't need to render anything. So you can see here, just below CAD, we're actually rendering that it is selected. This is pretty tough to look at, so let's apply some styles. So up here on the view, I'll say styles.row, representing the row, and then we'll also say style is equal to styles.text, representing the text in this row. And then we can import our styles, so import styles from our styles file, and then we can go ahead and actually start styling this. So jumping over to styles.js inside of our list component directory, we can set up row, and we can also set up text. And first thing we want to do for the row is actually give everything a bit of space just to breathe. And to do that, I'm just going to give padding horizontal of 20, and that'll keep things off the side. And then we'll also give some vertical space between things, so we can say padding vertical, and that's going to be 16. And that should just get everything spaced out a bit. And then to handle this CAD selected, the first thing we want to say is flex direction row, so they are sitting side by side rather than being stacked. Then we're also going to say justify content space between, and that's just going to say for the flex area that we've got, put as much space between these elements as we can. So then the selected will float over to the right and be in line with the CAD text. We're also going to want to make sure that things are vertically aligned, so we're going to say align item center, and then finally, just to ensure the background color is always white, in case the background color of the flat list actually changes, we'll say the background for the list item will be white. Alright, typo number 1 for this video. This should be align items. Now let's take care of this text. We're just going to bump the font size up to 16 here, and then we're also going to set the color to be that new dark text color that we set up. looking better, but we need that separator between this now just to make things start looking a bit better. And we'll actually set up the styles first because the component itself is super simple. So we're going to set up a separator. I'll try to spell separator correctly. And then inside of here, we want the border to, or the separator to be bumped off the left as much as the text is up here. So we're going to say margin left of 20, which is the same as the padding horizontal we've got up here. We also want to specify what the background color should be. And we have a variable in our styles already, and that's going to be border. So we'll just go ahead and copy that into it. We're also going to tell it to take up the entirety of the area that we're allotting it rather than giving it like a specific width. And then finally we want to set the height of it. And we're going to use a prop called stylesheet.hairline width. And that's just going to be the smallest possible value for the device the application is running on, because one pixel can look very different between different devices. So to access that, we're going to have to import style sheet from React Native. Let's actually set this up. So inside of this component, we're going to need to import React. We want to import Vue, and then finally we want to import styles from our styles file. And then we can just return a view here, and we're going to say style is equal to styles.separator. And we can actually render this for our flat list now. So going back to the currency list, we want to import our separator from our list directory. And to render the separator, we'll do that via the item separator component. And we just pass the actual component in there. So we're just going to say separator. Save that. And then we can see that we've got this separator between each one of our elements. And this border looks a little bit too dark for me, so I'm going to go to the border property and actually change that to E2, 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 and that'll just make it lighter for what we want. Alright, and things are really starting to come together here, but when we tap this, we want to make sure we actually specify exactly what the underlay color for each one of these list items is. Right now it's pretty close to what the border is, but we want to make sure we get it exactly the same. So we'll go to the list item. Actually, we'll go to the styles first. We're going to set up a new local variable, and we're going to say this is going to be called underlay color, and we're actually going to set that equal to exactly what the border is. We can't access the global style variables outside, but we can access these local ones. So we can then take this underlay color, save it, go back to our list item.js, and a prop we can pass to touchable highlight is actually underlay color. And then we'll set that equal to styles.underlay color, save it. And by seeing this, you can see that it's much more subtle, and it works better, but it's still clearly indicating that that row has been tapped. Alright, last thing we need to do is actually replace this selected text for CAD in this case with our actual icon. So what I'm going to do is import icon from icon, and then we'll just replace this text with the icon, and then we're actually going to replace this null with the icon as well. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to have this difference between actually specifying if the list item is selected and whether or not the icon should be visible or not. And regardless of if the icon should be visible or not, we need to make sure we keep that consistent spacing. So the icon needs to be rendered at all times. We'll just specify whether it should be visible or not. So we're going to add a few more props to this. First is going to be checkmark, and we're going to actually set a default value for this, and checkmark is going to be equal to true. So if the list item is selected and we don't specify otherwise, that checkmark is going to be automatically set. We're also going to specify whether it should be visible, whether the icon should be visible even if it is selected. And by default, we'll set that to true as well. So if the icon is selected, we'll assume that that you want to see the icon unless you specify otherwise. However, the selected prop, we're going to default that to false, just because most of the time the items are not going to be selected. Now let's go ahead and add the checkmark and visible to our prop types, just so we alleviate those warnings. And then we can pass checkmark down, and we're also going to pass visible down to our icon. We can go ahead and save all of this. That should be good to go. Now we can actually work on our icon component. So I'll jump over to that file. And before I forget, I'm going to specify exactly which props are going to be passed to it. So we know we've got the checkmark and visible. And I'm going to, and then I'm going to set up my imports, and we'll replace component with prop types, and we'll set these up. That way we can just focus on creating the component once we get to that prop. So icon.proptypes is going to be checkmark, is going to be proptypes.bool, and so is visible proptypes.bool. Want to make sure I spell this right. And then we can set up the imports we need for this component, and for this we're going to import the view as well as image, and the image is going to actually render the checkmark image if we should. So now we can actually start building this component. To do this, we're going to have some conditional logic in here, so we're just going to do a traditional function. And first thing, just because I know we've got to get there, so let's do it in the first place, is set up our icon style. So by default, we're going to have a plain icon, meaning we don't actually see anything on this side. And that's just going to be represented by styles.icon. It's going to hold the size and all that information, but have a transparent background and not actually display the check mark. And then if we know the icon should be visible, we're going to say icon styles.push styles.icon visible. Now, of course, we need to actually import our styles, so we're going to say import styles from. Now we can actually start rendering the icon itself. So in this case, the first thing we're going to do is just the background, so we can say we'll actually just pass the icon styles to this, and this can be a self-closing view for right now. And I made one of my default typos. It should be style, not styles. And now we can actually go ahead and start setting up these styles so we can see this. So going to my styles.js file, we know we've got icon and we've got icon visible. Now the primary difference between these two is the icon visible is going to have a visible background color, and that's going to be our primary blue. And the typical icon is just going to have a background color of transparent. We'll also give it a width of 30 and a height of 30 so we can see it. Now we should actually see the one for the CAD. We know we want it to be a circle, so we're going to say border radius is going to be equal to 15. Border radius should be half of whatever your width and height is to make a circle. And then last thing, this is for in the future, we're going to want to say align item center and justify content center. That way that icon in the middle will be centered vertically and horizontally. Excellent, excellent, getting there. And now we want to go back to our icon file, and we want to figure out whether this checkmark should be returned or not. So for here, I'm just going to actually change this view into no longer being a self-closing one. We'll add parentheses around this. Scroll down here, and then inside of here we're going to actually have an image component. And remember, for our source we need to specify where that image is coming from, and we can require /images, and then we can call check.png, and then make sure you close that component as well. Save it. Let's see what we've got. Alright, checkmark's working fine. One thing I want to add is actually in relation to this checkmark. First off, we don't know, well, we want to be able to specify whether the checkmark should be rendered or not, and we know that via prop. So we're going to pass that checkmark in like so. Save it, and everything's rendering because we know the checkmark should be visible. If I go back to the actual currency list item and I say checkmark equals false, we see the background rendered but not the checkmark. And we also know that for CAD it's currently selected, but if I set visible to false, if I spell it right, visible, we can see that even though it is selected, we're not showing the icon. And these are just things we're setting up for future uses of this list item. Okay, so back focusing on this list item, this icon is too big, so we want to actually go to our icon file, and then we want to set some styles for that. So we'll just say style is equal to styles.icon, then go back to our styles file, and I realize I've already got an icon style, so I want to change this to check icon. Scroll down here, save this, and then I'm just going to give it a width of 18. Save this, just about there. Again, we're getting that clipping issue we've had every other time we've worked with images. So we're going to give it the resize mode, and we're going to say contain, just contain that image in the given space. And we've got our check mark vertically and horizontally centered showing up, and we know that we can specify whether it should be visible or not, and whether or not the check mark should be visible or not. And I know that was a bunch of extra work for this seemingly very simple component, but we're doing that just so future lessons are much easier. And you can see how we build up complex components and then break them up into multiple different components just so they can really focus on one thing and doing that well. And then we compose those multiple components into one to actually function the way we want, and we can do that all via props being passed down from a parent component.